Hi, photo class. We're starting week 2, day 1, and I wanted to begin by discussing how we define art. By what criteria do we look at something and call it art? In this slideshow, this is called Contextualizing Art, and asking again, what is art? I wanted to first lay out this notion of surrender, because art today often is very controversial or has moments that produce sometimes distance between the general public and what's being presented, or seems a little specialized or about things that aren't necessarily easy to decipher without caring or knowing much about art. So I use this quote from C.S. Lewis from a text called an Experiment in Criticism. And C.S. Lewis was a kind of Christian apologist, so he's got an interesting perspective in this sense, with a lot of concrete ideas about what's right or wrong or true or not. And this is what he writes about encountering art. And he says in this text, "The first demand any work of art makes upon us is surrender. Look, listen, receive, get yourself out of the way. There's no good asking first whether the work before you deserves such a surrender, for until you have surrendered, you cannot possibly find out." What I like about this quote is the idea of first being curious, and if you find an artwork attracts you but also repels you for certain reasons, like you feel confused by it or offended or anything of that nature, what C.S. Lewis is arguing is that what better way to criticize an artwork than to do it on its own merit by understanding it. So rather than lobbing stones from outside the wall or trying to blow things up from a distance, why don't you get inside the work, get inside and understand it on its terms, and then determine whether or not it has good reasons or is valid or meaningful for you. So this idea of submitting to art, submit ourselves to what art is, the way that it wants us to see the world. Isn't art about what it means to be thinking through the world, thinking about the world, what it means to be human, who we are in this world, what the world is, thinking about it on spatial terms, thinking about it by configuring objects and forms in relation to each other? You can't understand the merit of a work until you've stepped inside the work. This is a risk. You're taking a risk. The structure might not be stable. You might be feeling like you're standing on unstable ground, or things that confuse you or don't feel are in line with your beliefs. But you can't know until you try. So contemporary art is met with suspicion, and I think it should be, actually. It's slippery and it's difficult. Art also, historically, it's taken a philosophical turn. It's no longer just picturing things. Things have changed in the last century. So why don't we talk about why? Often when I ask the question of what art is, one of the things that comes up naturally is this term beauty, things that are beautiful, things that are made well, that are well crafted. Things used to seem more simple, and we could use this term, but art was that maybe which society deemed as beautiful, and that was a good enough criteria. But however, generally speaking, it's been argued that determining if something exhibits beauty, we call that a judgment now, and therefore not always it's not always universally agreed upon. So why is it different now? There was a famous text by a philosopher and cultural critic named Immanuel Kant called The Critique of Judgment, and he writes, the mental stakes of looking at art is more complicated, and beauty causes this. He took out everything that could be seen subjectively as an individual and sought an objective or universal definition. So when you are looking at a work of art and you say, I like it, in essence, you're asking people to agree with you. He pulled out more formal elements like what does it look like? And for example, color can't be a criteria for what makes something beautiful, because you might prefer green and I might prefer red. And so we have our subjective ideas of what we think is a beautiful color, and therefore it doesn't really measure up or hold up as a definition we can agree upon as what makes something art. So I'm going to I'm going to jump around a little bit, but I'm going to focus on a very pivotal artwork by the artist Marcel Duchamp. Duchamp has had a significant impact in terms of what you see as art today. There was a poll done a few years back at an art fair of some of the leading artists in the world, and a significant amount of them cited this artwork by Marcel Duchamp as the most influential work on what they make today. So what you're seeing them produce and what has been generated and called art today in a successful way has some of its significant roots in this work. So let's talk about what this work is. This is an artwork titled Fountain by Marcel Duchamp. It was done in 1917. The image you're seeing is actually photographed by Alfred Stieglitz at the 291, which is a gallery. And this is complex work, mainly because Marcel Duchamp had been, like many people in Europe at that time, and artists and creatives, and in general, lots of people fleeing World War I, or what was called the Great War at the time. The time period here is 1914 to 1918 is that wartime. And so with the decimation of Europe happening, the new kind of cultural hub of the world is starting to establish itself in New York City. Marcel Duchamp is in New York City with a lot of other artists, and they form a society called the Society of Independent Artists, and they decide to have an exhibition where the criteria for exhibiting your work in this exhibition is that you have to be an artist who pays a fee, and you submit an artwork, and you'll get into this show. Now, Marcel Duchamp is kind of a subversive character at the time, and he decides to, he's part of this Society of Independent Artists who are actually organizing the show. And he decides to secretly submit an artwork under the pseudonym R. Mutt. And you can see in the image to the right, it's signed R. Mutt, 1917. Now, what you're looking at is what would be a modern day 1917 men's urinal for a men's restroom. And he had just gone down to a factory that mass produced these urinals and bought one, signed it, had it put kind of sideways or flattened onto the pedestal. So what you're looking at is, that's what you're looking at. And the organizers of the exhibit rejected the artwork. The committee rejected it and said that it wouldn't be accepted. Why that's important is that these are what would be considered the people who are at the time defining what art is, because they're the cultural producers at the time, the ones most visible. And so if what they said was the criteria for what defined art, in this case was everything was met, all that criteria was met by Marcel Duchamp or Armut, and it was rejected, then that therefore called into question what is art then, and what defines that, or who defines that. So I wanted to show that this is still being played out today. So this is from 1991, so it's a little dated, but this is a living artist named Damien Hirst, and what you're seeing is a tiger shark in formaldehyde enclosure. So Marcel Duchamp might be asking, does art become art because of its links to the art world, and or because the art world deemed them as such? Meaning, do those who are acting on behalf of a historical tradition of making or defining art, or part of the institutions that house or present art, are those the people that are in charge of defining what is or isn't art? So here we have an image of the Art Institute of Chicago. This is an image of the Art Institute of Chicago. This is, obviously an early picture, but this is a pretty massive structure, and it's one of the premier institutions for presenting artworks in the world. And so there's a lot of investment and construction into establishing a institution that will present and define what is relevant or significant as cultural objects, worth protecting, things that are given value that are worth protecting. So some history. The fine arts, painting, sculpture, music, pre-1740s or so in Western art, they were spread out. They were associated with other disciplines like mathematics and engineering. They became grouped in the academy, or in the institution of education. This is during a period of innovation called the Enlightenment. This is characterized by there being more leisure time. You start to see the first novels appear, etc. And so, again, this is the institution that's attached to the Art Institute. It's called the School of the Art Institute. So this is an institution that educates artists and tries to produce these cultural producers in the world, or people that will create art. Initially, it was thought that what grouped the fine arts was that which generated pleasure, right? This brings us back to beauty. So art was the imitation of nature or the cause of pleasure, and that caused in an audience states which they could enjoy for their own sake. This pleases me. I like how it looks. So you get examples like the Mona Lisa. This would be a good example of the imitation of nature, trying to present an image, a representation that looks real or looks as if I'm looking at the actual thing itself. But again, beauty, this term, we might use the word aesthetics. Pleasure doesn't work as helping us define art, because so many other things are linked to pleasure, such as taking a warm shower or eating candy. Art is more complicated than these experiences. So back to this moment around Duchamp, around 1914, is a good marker for this break with beauty. We use the term modernism. Whereas prior, there was a desire to represent the world or nature as it looked visually, we see abstraction that wants to use color as a mode of expression. So you might think maybe Vincent van Gogh, or in addition, for our sakes, we start to look at the advent of photography and film. We have a medium that performs better at representing the world visually than what we were just seeing with something like the Mona Lisa. We also see objects that are, as Duchamp coins them, ready-mades, and he uses this term, fountain. And so he's taking objects in the world and putting them through some kind of process that then defines them as art as opposed to any other thing. So modernism is similar to the Enlightenment, as it is a historical movement that attacks the past conceptions of art. So a good example of photography versus painting. So we see the image on the right is a painting of Abraham Lincoln. It's very stylized. It's embellished. It's got a lot of liberty, subjective liberty by the artist, whereas the image on the left, which is a photograph, it's much harsher and much more realistic, and gets to the heart of what painting was trying to do forever. So we see this break where the threat of photography on painting leads to one of the things that leads to So what we see on the right here is a painting of Abraham Lincoln, and that painting is embellished. It's dramatized. There's a lot of subjectivity and liberty taken by the artist to make Lincoln look a certain way that might reflect an opinion, whereas on the left is much harsher. It's a photograph of Lincoln, and is much more brutally honest and comes closer to the true nature of what Abraham may have looked like. And so photography becomes a real threat to painting, and painting actually has to figure out how to reinvent itself, because its mission has changed, because it's being done better by photography in some sense. So again, how do we define art? We might define it by these social links. Does art have a link to the art world? That's Duchamp is questioning. What is the art world? It's not just those involved in the art market, but maybe anybody who wants to be in the art world is. The art world is the institution that carries maybe just a historical tradition of making art. These are complicated questions. So maybe we need to come back and really hash out, why is fountain art? So the difference between Duchamp's fountain and the everyday urinal is Duchamp would claim it's in its link to the art world. So that transformation from it being just in a bathroom or in a factory to then being placed in an art context, and being therefore seen as having a link to this art world, is what defines it as art. Something is a work of art if it is first an artifact, and secondly, somebody acting on behalf of the art world has put it forward as a candidate for appreciation as art. And so you have what might be an artist, and they make an artifact and they put it forward. They say, I want the world, or I want you to appreciate this as art. And that's something that then therefore makes it art. This is what might be called the institutional model for what art is, and there's some problems with this that we can hash out later throughout the semester. But for now, just know that that's what's going on, or what exists. Now, it's important that there are reasons for why something is a work of art, though. And so we might ask that question of how might what art is be better served by asking, are the reasons good enough? So there are, of course, many reasons for why something is potentially art, but are there reasons convincing or good enough for us to care and pay attention? So let's try this as an exercise. So is this object art that you see on the right hand side? And imagine it as a thing maybe in the world. So imagine that you're looking at the actual object itself sitting in front of you. So why or why not? Why would this be art, or why would it not be art? Currently, the object is acting most appropriately as a coffee cup. So that's pretty straightforward. So often I'll have students in this exercise try to make claims that this is a designed object and it's creative. There is some kind of creative investment in it. So then it's art in this state. And I would argue that's not the case. It hasn't become art yet. But just because something's creative or designed well doesn't make it necessarily art. There are a lot of things in the world that are creatively produced or designed well, but I wouldn't put them in that category. So what happens if I, for instance, I'm your what you would consider your artist? I have this object and I want to put it forward in the world, and I want it to be considered or seen and appreciated as a candidate for appreciation or as an artwork. And I move it to a pedestal in a generic art gallery. So imagine you're looking at this. The coffee cup is now sitting on top of the pedestal. The coffee cup has gone through a process and has become about coffee mug, possibly, or maybe it's become about the nature of mass consumed objects, or maybe the politics of coffee, or whatever an artist is trying to communicate. Maybe there's a title that helps us with that. Maybe it's part of a larger exhibit that helps it make more sense. The coffee cup, though, now exhibits what might be called aboutness. There's a typo there. All art does this. Therefore, anything can become art, but not everything is art. If everything is art, then we wouldn't be able to function in our daily lives. We would question the aboutness of everything at every moment. Why cup? Why computer? Why keyboard? You could imagine getting out of bed and looking down and saying, why slippers? Why sheets? Why bathroom? Why toothbrush? Etc. It'd be very confusing because you'd be questioning the aboutness of everything. This is a human construct and is deeply human. We communicate through representation in ways we cannot by using other means. For example, language, possibly alone, although that has also its complications. So at this point, I like to talk about, early humans. This is the Shavat Caves, which are in France. They were discovered years ago, and they were discovered as a state that was highly preserved. They were inside of a collapsed hillside that, by the nature of its how the cave was collapsed, very little oxygen got into this space and preserved it in a state that looks as though it was made yesterday. It's phenomenal. What you're looking at is cave paintings. These are dated 30,000 years. What's amazing about this is that you can see some claw marks against the wall where creatures like bears and stuff came into these caves and would scratch the walls, and they were able to date some of the drawings on here, the paintings, between them upwards of 5,000 years, meaning humans were coming back to this same spot and drawing over these same drawings in 5,000 year intervals. Now there's a lot of theories about why these exist, but some of the most recent would be from a film called The Cave of Forgotten Dreams by a director named Werner Herzog. He made a claim that these are kind of proto-cinema of sort, where you could imagine maybe the elder men, possibly in a tribe, bringing in, through initiation, the younger men, bringing them into these caves, lighting a fire, scaring them possibly by having the light flicker against these drawings on the caves, and which would animate them and make them look alive. Again, a form of representation. So art may be bad, good, or indifferent, but whatever adjective is used, we must call it art. And bad art is still art in the same way as a bad emotion is still an emotion. This is Marcel Duchamp again, much later in 1957. So the big question, and this brings us back again to this idea of reasons, like is art giving us good reasons for caring? Is why should you spend your time viewing art? And those are things that I think you on a personal level can tease out and figure out on an individual basis. But at least at this point, I think I'd like to say that we have or can establish a grounding for what criteria we use for defining something as art moving forward. All right.